Today, I want to introduce our speaker, Necati Alkan, and you'll note that the C there in his first name is pronounced like a J. That's the standard pronunciation of Turkish. If the C has a little cedilla underneath it, it's a CH sound. So those are the rules for knowing how to pronounce Turkish words. Necati was born in Turkey, was educated in Germany, received his PhD in history from the Ruhr University in Bochum in 2004. He has also studied at the School of Oriental and African Studies in London, 1999-2000. He's taught at Yıldız Teknik Üniversitesi in Istanbul, has held a postdoctoral position at Hebrew University in Jerusalem, and also was a visiting scholar there in 2012. He has done various other teaching opportunities at universities. He's taught at the Center for Anatolian Civilizations at Koç University in Istanbul, where he's been working particularly about research on the Nusayris, an Islamic, I believe, Shiite sect, especially in Syria. Currently, he's at Otto Friedrich University in Bamberg as a faculty member in Middle Eastern Studies. In addition to all that, he's also published a book, and now my information about the books are covered up, so I have to see if I can't get at that. Book was called Dissent and Heterodoxy in the Late Ottoman Empire, Reformers, Babis, and Baha'is, published by ISIS Press in Istanbul in 2008, a revision of his doctoral dissertation. He's been particularly interested in studying the relationship between Abdu'l-Bahá and Ottoman reformers and Turkish reformers subsequently, and that's part of the work he's done. He's also published various articles on related topics. So I think I will, at this point, wrap up my introduction and welcome Necati. Thank you so much for joining us today, Necati, and we're very much looking forward to hearing your presentation about Abdu'l-Bahá and social reform.
Thank you so much, Rob, for inviting me. I'm happy to be here with you. Welcome, everyone. As Rob said, my topic is the magic touch of progress, Ottoman social transformation. But I realized that while I was preparing the presentation that I did more work on the historical background of Abdu'l-Bahá's thoughts, of the environment in which he lived in the Ottoman Empire, and also the world of ideas, or the setting, the intellectual setting in Iran. So this is what I'm going to talk about today. It's more about the historical background, the intellectual background of Abdu'l-Bahá and his context with Ottoman reformers, and to some extent with Iranian reformers in the late 19th century. Before I head to my topic, I would like to share with you a few thoughts, an outline of the late Ottoman period, of the reform period, which aimed at westernization and the modernization of the Ottoman Empire. It's basically, it started in the late 18th century, in 1789, when the Sultan Selim III started military reforms in the Ottoman Empire, which were not much successful, but then his nephew Mahmud II continued with more serious reforms from 1808 until 1839. And what he did actually paved the way for later reforms and the centralization, actually, of the rule in Istanbul. And then in 1839, we have the Tanzimat period starting, which means reorganization or reform, which lasted until 1876. And these were initiated by Sultan Abdul-Majid, who ruled until 1861. And these were actually extensive reforms in all spheres of the Ottoman Empire, and political, social, institutional. And later, his brother Abdulaziz continued these reforms, And Abdulaziz, we well know from Baha'i history, actually. We will deal with that probably later. So the Tanzimat period lasted until 1876, more or less successful. It was definitely the basis for later reforms, even in the Turkish Republic. And then there is a break in 1876 because Abdulaziz was deposed and died in that year. And after 3 months of an ineffective interregnum of Murad V, who was Sultan for the 3 months, the same year Sultan Abdul-Hamid, or Prince Abdul-Hamid, became Sultan Abdul-Hamid II. And then we have these 2 years of the so-called first constitutional era, because in 1876, the first Ottoman Constitution was proclaimed and the first parliament was set up. And this was until 1878. So in the time of Sultan Abdul Majid, starting from 1839, so as I said, the reform period was officially announced with the first edict, which guaranteed this and secured the safety of the life, honor, and property of all the subjects of the Ottoman Empire, regardless of their religious background, ethnic background. It introduced a new tax system, conscription into the army was announced, and it was the military service was limited for a certain period. And there were many other reforms, like provincial cabinets, which included leaders of Muslim and non-Muslim communities. And then in 1856, we have a second edict, the second Tanzimat edict, which reiterated actually the equality of all Ottoman subjects, again, regardless of ethnic and religious background. It pronounced the equality of Muslims and non-Muslims, especially Christians, because this second edict was actually announced under the pressure of European powers like Britain and France. And so especially the Christians should, it was emphasized that the Christians in the Ottoman Empire should get equal rights with Muslims. And it went so far actually that this equality the Christians got from the Ottoman administration in Istanbul gave them even more advantages over the Muslims, and which was to be a problem later for the Ottoman Empire. And then we have many other political and social reforms in that period. But all these reforms paved the way for the first Ottoman Constitution later in 1876. And then we have Sultan Abdulaziz, who continued the Tanzimat reforms under the leadership of his chief ministers, Fuad Pasha and Ali Pasha, also well known in Baha'i history. These were the ministers who actually, decided the continuous exiles of Bahá'u'lláh in the Ottoman Empire. And these two persons exchanged offices as prime and foreign minister until their death in 1869 and 1861. And during this period of Abdulaziz, I won't get into details, but just mention a few things. New provinces were set up in 1864, for example, and what is important, a Council of State was set up in 1868, which had a consultative nature. And then the public education was based on the French model in 1861, and then railroads were built in Anatolia and farther away up to Baghdad. We have the first civil code in the Ottoman Empire, and which means that especially these two pashas, Mufad and Ali Pasha, actually, they moved away from the Islamic Sharia to secular European model of state, which happened gradually. And then we have Abdulaziz as the first Ottoman Sultan going to Western Europe in 1867, and there he met Napoleon III and Queen Victoria of Britain, also well known in Baha'i history. because Baha'u'lláh addressed them in tablets, and then many other, as I said, reforms were realized by Abdulaziz. One of the reforms which actually contributed to his fate and to the bankruptcy of the Ottoman Empire was the expensive modernization of the navy, which caused Abdulaziz financial difficulties. And then in 1875, around that year, there were natural disasters and other things in the Ottoman Empire. And also the fact that Abdulaziz continuously built new palaces led to the Ottoman public debt that was announced in October 1875. And so there was a commotion actually in the Ottoman Empire when all this happened, and some intellectuals and some ministers after the death of Fuad and Ali Pasha, they were not happy with all these developments, so they decided to depose Abdulaziz. So he was arrested and put in one of the palaces and he was watched by guards, and then the next day when they opened the door, he was lying in his own blood, and so apparently it was a suicide, but until today it's really not clear the circumstances of the death of Abdulaziz. In any case, since 1865, young Ottoman intellectuals who were partly or mostly also aware of European culture and civilization and had spent time there, they opposed these from top-down state reforms which Ali and Fuad Pasha were realizing. And this group called the Young Ottomans, they were basically against superficial reforms and westernization of Ali and Fuad Pasha. They thought that these two pashas were too elitist and autocratic and favored a bureaucratic oligarchy, actually. So Ali and Fuad were not shy to say that a few ministers who were well versed in the art of politics, if you will, should rule the empire, and they were against any democratic institutions and the parliament and so on. So what these young Ottomans, they opposed these two pashas, and during this rule of bureaucratic rule of Ali and Fuad Pasha, even the Sultan's power was limited, and the reforms went along Western ideals and laws, and this Sharia became less important. But these young Ottomans, they wanted a synthesis of Islam and the West, and they claimed actually Islamic roots for words such as parliament, consultation, and so on, and said they were even existent in the early history of Islam. And with the young Ottomans, we have actually the beginning of the Islamist movement that we know that has gone a different direction, but this is actually the start of the Islamist movement. And initially, as I said, they wanted a synthesis between Islam and the West. And after Ali and Fuad died, the young Ottomans were successful and realized their goals. They announced the first constitution and parliament with representatives of all ethnic and religious groups. And they were discussing an ideology called Ottomanism, which should foster a group feeling among the subjects of the Ottoman Empire, regardless of their background. And this should have prevented actually the nationalisms in the late Ottoman Empire, but Ottomanism actually failed, because as we know, many of the groups, especially in the Balkans, and then later on in the Arab provinces, they discovered their national background, if you will, Greeks, for example, Greek nationalism was successful later on. And so this also contributed to the decline of the Ottoman Empire later. Now we come to a person who probably you know, it's Mithapasha. He was the patron of the young Ottomans in the 1870s. Mithapasha was well known in Europe because of his liberal ideas, and he was a successful reformer in several provinces in the Balkans and then in Baghdad and in Syria later on. He was also twice, even though for very short periods, prime minister of the Ottoman Empire in 1872 for actually 2 or 3 months, and then in 1876 and 1877. He was known as the father of the liberals or father of the Ottoman Constitution. And as I said, this constitution gave equal rights for all citizens, and it emphasized an independent judiciary based on civil rather than religious law. It provided universal elementary education, and it set up a bicameral parliament and a senate appointed by the Sultan, and so on. And but again, internal and financial and diplomatic crises in 1875, as I actually mentioned, provided Midhat a chance to introduce the constitution. And Mithapasha is actually responsible for the deposition and as some say, also for the death of Abdulaziz. And we come to Sultan Abdulhamid II, who was installed by Midhat Pasha in 1876 as Sultan. And initially, Abdulhamid II agreed to the constitution and parliament. But later on, with the outbreak of the Ottoman-Russian War in 1877-78, after which the Ottomans were defeated, and many the Russians actually occupied Ottoman territory in the Balkans, including, for example, Edirne, which, as you know, was also foretold by Bahá'u'lláh. And so Abdulhamid used this confusion of the war, and he suspended the parliament and constitution in 1878, and ruled after that like a one-man show, if you will, until 1908. For 33 years, he ruled alone. Of course, he had assemblies and other ministers and so on, but it was through Abdulhamid that really everything happened in the Ottoman Empire. And so he actually centralized the power of the Sultan again in Istanbul. And Abdulhamid was suspicious of anyone with liberal ideas, and he set up a very vast spy network and censorship in the Ottoman Empire, because and his suspicion derived from this mysterious death of Abdulaziz, who was his uncle. And so Abdulhamid couldn't trust really anyone, and later he even got rid of Midhat Pasha due to the Abdulaziz affair. And he let him exile, actually, first as governor in Syria, and then he called him back, and then a court was set up, and then Abdulhamid sentenced Midhat Pasha to exile in what is now Saudi Arabia, on the Arabian Peninsula. And a few years later, Midhat Pasha was killed in his prison cell. And some historians say that it was Abdulhamid who let it happen this. Nevertheless, Abdulhamid was a very able statesman. He was very clever, and he continued, even though he ruled alone, if you will, he continued with far-reaching modernization of the empire. And it was actually, even though he appeared to be a devout Muslim, it was actually during his period that the Ottoman Empire became more and more secular, and especially reforms in education. Abdulhamid set up secular Ottoman schools with all kinds of subjects, technical and other schools. And this was also meant to counter foreign missionary influence, actually. And Abdulhamid utilized the ideology of pan-Islamism for the unity of Muslims, not only in the Ottoman Empire, but even up to Japan, to China. And this should give the Muslims an Ottoman Islamic identity and morality, and which was also taught at schools in the Ottoman Empire. And one of his intention to set up schools in the provinces actually was to civilize unruly non-Sunni peoples and converting them to the Ottoman version, to the Ottoman Hanafi version of Sunnism. And despite his reforms and his efforts, the Ottoman Empire lost territories, especially in the Balkans, later on in the 1890s. And now, coming closer to my topic, we know that Baha'u'lláh had contacts with many Ottoman statesmen. He had good relations with some, but also bad ones, especially in Istanbul after he was exiled to Istanbul. And, I will just repeat it, even though you know this. For example, in one of his tablets, he says that nothing has been seen from Istanbul's inhabitants but conventional officious formalities. And then with regard to statesmen in Istanbul, he stated that they were not mature enough. And he compared them like being children who gathered about and disporting themselves with clay. So he didn't take them for serious. And as you also know, he heavily criticized Ali and Fuad Pasha in the Lohe Rais, Surei Rais, and Lohe Fuad. And in this respect, his criticism of some Ottoman statesmen was similar to that of the young Ottoman reformers, who also thought that there were no justice in the Ottoman Empire, that the rulers didn't care for the people, and so on. And despite the injustice by Abdulaziz, because of this unjust exile, not to Istanbul and then to Edirne later and then to Akka, Baha'u'lláh still presents himself as an advisor. And when in the Surat al-Muluk, which is in this compilation, The Summons of the Lord of Hosts, he advises the Sultan to follow the commandments of God, to act impartially towards his subjects, not to allow anybody to oppress them, to be a just king, and so on. And then he tells Abdulaziz that he should not leave the affairs of the state into the hand of others, especially not to rely on his ministers who are not worthy of his trust, but on ministers who are upright and just. And this is already like these characteristics Baha'u'lláh wanted to see in some Ottoman statesmen. This also was Abdu'l-Bahá later repeated in the Secret of Divine Civilization, for example. One important point that Baha'u'lláh makes in his tablets is that he tells Abdulaziz to take counsel with them, like with the ministers in state affairs. And this necessity of consultation actually in human affairs in general, and specifically in the government, is a Quranic/Islamic notion, which is shura, and which is still used in Turkey, for example. And consultation, as you know, as Baha'is, it's one of the basic principles of the Baha'i faith. But in the Middle East, in the 19th century, in the Ottoman and in Iranian empires, it was a common terminology of those intellectuals and reformers who used consultation to mean parliament and that which would imply real democracy, actually. And then Baha'u'lláh somewhere else also tells the Ottoman statesmen that the real aim of the prophets is the rehabilitation of the peoples of the earth. And despite his criticism of the Ottomans in many of his tablets, in one tablet he commends Sultan Abdul Hamid actually for being occupied day and night personally with the reformation of the subjects and the empire. And ultimately Baha'u'lláh presents himself in his writings as the life giver and world reformer, which actually gives this other vision, because the Ottoman reformers, Iranian reformers, were limited to their country, and Bahá'u'lláh was emphasizing that reforms are needed for the whole world, even though he was in the Ottoman Empire. And then when we come to Abdu'l-Bahá in this context with Ottoman statesmen, he's reported to say in one of his recorded talks, to have said that the thoughts of the statesmen of the East were atrophied, their hearts devoid of desire for the progress of the nation, their ideas petty, selfish, local, and not general. They thought of their own interests rather than of those of the country. And then Abdu'l-Bahá goes on saying, they think more of the advancement of their own interests than of those of the country. They are not far-seeing patriots, but inexperienced tyros. They sell the resources of their country if they think that by so doing they can fill their own pockets. But Abdu'l-Bahá was not only negative about Ottoman statesmen. We know that from early on in Baghdad, where he was a child, he was known for his intellectual capacities and wisdom, and many men of learning, be it Ottoman officials or Iranian expatriates in Baghdad, they came to ask for his advice and put forward philosophical questions to Abdu'l-Bahá, and his replies amazed them all, as we know from Baha'i sources. And in Edirne also, he was widely known for his qualities and deep intellect. And Ottoman officials, high and low, were his admirers. And one of them was the governor of Edirne, Mehmed Hurshid Pasha, who at some point apparently consulted Abdu'l-Bahá about the future of the Ottoman Empire. And then Abdu'l-Bahá tells him a story about a sick man who was given opium by the watchman that did not recover the sick man, but made him sleep and got worse, even though the doctor had said that this watchman should be careful that the sick man shouldn't sleep during the night. But it was easier for the watchman that the sick man slept, and so he gave him opium, and then the watchman could also sleep during the night. And then Abdu'l-Bahá tells the governor, it is your watch time. You are not doing anything to improve the condition of the sick country. You are putting it to sleep by giving it narcotics. And when you leave your position, what do you care whether the patient will live or die? You have had your night's sleep. Instead of watching the patient solicitously and pulling him through, you prefer your own rest and comfort. So this is one of the realistic assessments of Abdu'l-Bahá, I would say, on the situation of the Ottoman Empire at that time. We have many other contexts of Abdu'l-Bahá with Ottoman officials, high and low, as I said, and I will just go very quickly through this. For example, at some point, one of the intellectuals says that Abdul Abbas Effendi is an erudite, noble figure who is cognizant of the conditions of the age. Or elsewhere, someone says, if Abbas Effendi's character and attitude are carefully examined, it appears that his behavior and manner remind of being more political than sheikh-like. And continuing, if an article on Iran in the foreign press came across his attentive eyes, he would, devoting himself to it, explain his thoughts for hours and enjoy this so much that he sacrificed his sleep and comfort. Sometimes, having written articles in Arabic and Persian, he sent them with their French translations to the European press. And with this, we know that Abdu'l-Bahá was active in promoting Baha'i ideas in the West, in Europe and elsewhere. And then we have another intellectual who knew Abdu'l-Bahá from his childhood and said at some point, in my childhood and youth, I often used to be in his erudite presence and would profit from the purse of his wisdom and perfect exemplary conduct. Everybody at his gatherings was filled with admiration about his superior merits and was a lover of his natural disposition and virtues. To those present in his assembly, Sheikh Effendi would only talk about science, morality, philosophy, and the arts, and nothing would proceed from his mouth except that by which the listeners would benefit from the abundance of his knowledge. One Ottoman official who is less known, I guess, in Baha'i history, and who I discovered through the Turkish letters of Abdu'l-Bahá, was someone called Hassan Bedretti Pasha, or Bedri Pasha, who was a military commander, a writer and translator from French. And he was, as a soldier, involved in the deposition of Sultan Abdulaziz, and for this reason he was exiled to Palestine and Syria in the late 19th century, and where he served as colonel. And after the 1908 Young Turk revolution, Bedri was governor general in an Albanian province. And Persian Baha'i sources mention Bedri Bey as being exiled to Akka, being the translator of Abdu'l-Bahá into French, and being a Baha'i, actually. And there are many letters of Abdu'l-Bahá and vice versa, Bedri Pasha to Abdu'l-Bahá, which talk about Baha'i principles. And some of the Turkish letters of Abdu'l-Bahá to Bedri Pasha have political content, and in which Abdu'l-Bahá, for example, praises Bedri Pasha's exceptional administration in Albania, encourages Bedri Pasha to establish unity based on Baha'i core beliefs by abolishing division and enmity among the many peoples in the province. And he says, Abdu'l-Bahá says, that the means for this foremost achievement would be the diffusion of knowledge and education, making it accessible to all, and so delivering the diverse sects from evils and foolish prejudices. And then at some point, Abdu'l-Bahá also proposes one practical and beneficial step for the security of the country. He says that the construction of roads everywhere would be good in this mountainous province. And here you see Bedri Pasha with his military in Albania. So as far as we know, he was a Baha'i, but at that time, Baha'i identities could be fluid. So we didn't have the administration as we have it today. So it's interesting to know about this person. And again, coming back to Mithapasha, we know that when Mithapasha was governor of Syria, he met Abdu'l-Bahá in Akka, actually, and in the Rezvan Garden in May 1880. And from an unpublished memoir of Mirza Haydar Ali, who we know as the Angel of Carmel, he says that he reports that Mithat Pasha was longing to meet Abdu'l-Bahá for a long time, and having said that Mithat Pasha had seen utterances of Abdu'l-Bahá in Turkish that are beyond like or equal or eloquently testify to his vast knowledge. I have often heard many of the learned highly praising and extolling him. Later, when before Mithat Pasha left to Beirut, and later in Beirut, he invited Abdu'l-Bahá to his palace, if you will, because Beirut was the administrative center of Syria at that time. And Shoghi Effendi says in God Passes By that it was through the extraordinary warm reception accorded him during his visit to Beirut, through his contact with Mithat Pasha, a former Grand Vizier of Turkey, and through his constant association with officials, notables, and leading ecclesiastics who in increasing number had besought his presence, that he had succeeded in raising the prestige of the cause he had championed to a level it had never previously attained. So this is really very, very important, this contact with Mithat Pasha in Beirut and later with other many famous people. One of them was the Grand Mufti of Cairo, Muhammad Abdu, who was a religious reformer. We also have a report of his meeting with Abdu'l-Bahá. Here you see Abdu'l-Bahá in some Ottoman journals, in various articles. And then coming to my main topic, now Abdu'l-Bahá, as I said, I hope that as you could see, since he was really active and had many contacts with Ottoman and later also Iranian intellectuals, he was, I would say, the best person who could write about topics such as the civilization or politics in the Ottoman Empire and Iran. And of course, when we talk about politics, it's a different level of politics than the politics we are seeing today in the world. In any case, so his Secret of Divine Civilization, the Risalih-yi Siyasiyyih, he composed in 1875, and it was translated into English in 1918 for the first time with the title The Mysterious Force of Civilization, and then a second revised translation was done by Marzi Gale in 1957. And again, Shoghi Effendi says in The World Order of Bahá'u'lláh, The Secret of Divine Civilization, Abdu'l-Bahá's outstanding contribution for the future reorganization of the world. So it really highlights how important this short treatise of Abdu'l-Bahá is. And as you know, there are many charters of the Baha'i faith, including the Kitab-i-Aqdas, the Will and Testament of Abdu'l-Bahá, or the Tablets of the Divine Plan. And I think we can put Secret of Divine Civilization within the list of these charters, since Shoghi Effendi says it's a contribution to future reorganization of the world. So it cannot be underestimated. Abdu'l-Bahá wrote it anonymously. He didn't put his name under the treatise, and it was also published anonymously. And it was the second Baha'i book ever printed in Bombay in 1882. And on the right, you see the first page of that edition. And it illustrates really the importance was given to this treatise. And Abdu'l-Bahá, which is one thing which is very interesting, is that in no line in this Secret of Divine Civilization, Abdu'l-Bahá mentions the name Baha'i or anything. He addressed it to a non-Baha'i audience, primarily Iranian intellectuals, at a time when modernization and reforms were important contemporary issues in Iran, of course influenced by Ottoman reforms. And the text of Secret of Divine Civilization suggests that Abdu'l-Bahá was writing this as a concerned citizen, offering constructive ideas pertinent to the ultimate well-being of his native land. And if you allow me, I want to quote Mujan Momin, who wrote an excellent article about reform, the influence of Baha'i thoughts on Ottoman reform movements, where he says, when Abdu'l-Bahá's Risalih-yi Madaniyat was written in 1875, it was distributed anonymously and is said to have achieved a wide readership among the Iranian intelligentsia, particularly after its printing in 1882. But later, when its authorship became known, no one would admit to having read it, mainly because of the fact that those so influenced would never admit to this, since any degree of association with what was regarded as a heretical and religiously obnoxious sect would be a bar to one's advancement in public life or the acceptance of one's views. So we know Abdu'l-Bahá had directly or indirectly influenced those reform discourse actually in the Middle East. Now we also know, and I discovered this recently, that Baha'u'lláh instructed Abdu'l-Bahá to write it actually. In one of his tablets, Baha'u'lláh says, "O most mighty branch, it would be commendable if some pages were written on the causes of the world's destruction and the means for its reconstruction, in such wise that it would humble the prejudiced to a degree that this may prepare them to listen to the rustling of the low tree of utterance, which can be heard in this day. Other themes of this sort were also heard from the ancient tongue, and consequently that branch of God composed the Secret of Divine Civilization." Abdu'l-Bahá himself calls the Risalih-yi Madaniyah a tribute to the high endeavor of Nasr-ed-Din Shah, the incumbent Qajar ruler at that time, to improving the conditions in Iranian society. He calls his treatise a brief statement on certain urgent questions. The Secret of Divan Civilization was a response to the reformist policies of Mirza Hussein Khan, known as Mushir al-Dawleh, who was actually Iranian ambassador in Istanbul when also Bahá'u'lláh was there in exile. And later, Mirza Hussein Khan returned to Iran, became prime minister, and started these reforms in Iran after the model of Ottoman reforms. So he emulated Ottoman reforms, initiated administrative and political reforms in Iran. But this met opposition of conservative religious and the political establishment in Iran. But Abdu'l-Bahá explicitly expresses his support for Hussein Khan's reforms in The Secret of Divan Civilization. And Abdu'l-Bahá also engages in a more general discourse on the relationship between Islam and modernity, which is very important and very also at that time up to date, if you will. But secular and atheist intellectuals in the Middle East blamed Islam actually for the backwardness of the Muslim people, and they saw, and on the other hand, the ulama or the clerics saw the solution for the country's problems in the return to original Islam. So both parties saw an inherent enmity between Islam and modernity. And Abdu'l-Bahá actually argues against this dichotomy, and he intends to demonstrate that Islam is compatible with modern reforms. And going just very quickly through the contents of Secret of Divan Civilization, one thing is that in many places Abdu'l-Bahá deplores the backwardness and decadence in Iran, and for this he proposes many specific reforms, which you can see here. One of them is most important, probably, is the extension of education throughout the country, and then about court procedure, and to limit, giving a definite limit to the appeal procedure for litigation and so on, development of useful arts and sciences, promoting industry and technology, and many other things, and also guaranteeing individual rights such as security of property and equality before the law, and so on and so forth. So this will all be discussed in the upcoming course starting 1st of April. I won't get too much into it now, but what is important is that Abdu'l-Bahá, after really talking and listing about these reforms, he says that if members of the society and the assemblies he proposes are not righteous, God-fearing, high-minded, and incorruptible, then all reforms will be useless. So he puts the emphasis on ethical education, actually. And furthermore, he stresses the importance of religion, and he says that reform and progress is only possible if people are high-minded and just, and that progress and civilization is dependent on the unity and agreement between the members of society. And he says that the only instrument which can ensure this is religion. And he furthermore highlights the importance of education of all sorts, from reading and writing and other sorts, types of education in schools, which he also realized later in Iran. And another important point, which was also discussed among Middle Eastern intellectuals at that time, is the role of Europe. Whereas many Middle Eastern reformers were pro-European in all respects, Abdu'l-Bahá says that the East should get the useful things from Europe, like science, social administration, and so on, but not the European morals. He says that European civilization and culture is superficial and morally bankrupt. And he advises men of learning, especially the religious ones, that they should be examples to other people by acquiring spiritual and material perfections or religious, scientific, and cultural knowledge, and to be defenders and promoters of the faith, and to avoid fanaticism. And then we have another treatise by Abdu'l-Bahá called the Risalih-yi Siyasiyyih, which he composed around 1892. And this is actually a response to what is called the tobacco revolt or protest in Iran from 1890 to 1892. During these years, actually Nasreddin Shah granted the monopoly of tobacco in Iran to a British citizen, and so meaning that the British could plant, harvest, and do anything with the tobacco in Iran without the interference of the Iranians. Of course, this staggered popular revolt in Iran during these years, and Abdu'l-Bahá, by responding to this, he in this treatise on politics, he refers to various aspects of politics and society. And just briefly, he, for example, says that man-made laws are not enough to enable human progress, and that divine law or religion is indispensable to educate the people. And especially one of the highlights, I would say, of the treatise on politics is that Abdu'l-Bahá says that interference of religious leaders, the ulama, especially the ignorant ones, in political affairs is dangerous. This was demonstrated in that tobacco revolt in Iran, and Abdu'l-Bahá says that the religious leaders shouldn't interfere in politics. And then we have another Turkish tablet of Abdu'l-Bahá talking about Ottoman and Iranian reform, where he also addresses Iran's worsening conditions caused by ignorant ulama, and that Iran needs reform after the model of the Ottomans, actually. And Abdu'l-Bahá here emphasizes secular reforms for Iran. And he again repeats here as well that clerics should only be concerned with spiritual and ethical matters and be useful in educating the people and guide their conduct. And then lastly, maybe there is another, it's the same actually. Which I mentioned, I'm sorry, this was a double slide. And then we have a Persian tablet to the Young Turks. As you know, the Young Turks, they were the second generation of Ottoman reformers from the 1890s on. In 1889, some young intellectuals, actually all from the medical school in Istanbul, formed this society called Committee of Union and Progress, CUP, which became more political and was a secret organization and spread all over the Ottoman Empire. And then they were so successful and powerful that they staged the Young Turk Revolution in 1908, which, as you know, freed Abdu'l-Bahá as a political prisoner. And Abdu'l-Bahá actually, previous to his release in 1908, had many contacts, apparently to many secret contacts, if you will, to Young Turks in the Ottoman Empire, and with whom also he was communicating and was friends with. And in one of his Persian tablets, he refers to the similarity between the ideals and goals of the CUP and those of the Baha'is. He says that both seek freedom, love liberty, hope for equality, that both the Baha'is and the Young Turks are well-wishers of humanity and ready to sacrifice their lives to unite humanity. But he says that the CUP goals are concerned only with the physical world and only with the Ottoman Empire. And he says that the goals of the Baha'is are broader and includes all of humanity. And he cautions the members of the Young Turk movement not to rely on conventional politics. And he says that however much human politics shows progress, it's nothing compared to divine politics. And then I will quote him here. He says, divine politics is the light of the physical world and an immeasurable mercy that encompasses all peoples and nations. Therefore, we need to follow divine politics, especially in this glorious century and this age of the progress of humanity in which nothing but divine politics leads to success. And then again, now all the peoples of the East must be content and happy with this politics, meaning the divine politics or the divine policy, and delighted in the pervading influence of the teachings of Bahá'u'lláh in Europe and America. And as you can see here, Abdu'l-Bahá tried to infuse Baha'i thoughts to many Ottoman intellectuals. He actively contributed to the discourse of reform, of unity on the Ottoman Empire. But as we know, unfortunately, as Bahá'u'lláh was not heeded previously, also many intellectuals did not heed Abdu'l-Bahá's counsels and advices, and the Ottoman Empire collapsed after the First World War. Which is important to mention, and then I will finish also with my presentation, is that Abdu'l-Bahá in various places talks about material and divine civilization, which I want to share with you here. One of the statements is in the selections from the writings of Abdu'l-Bahá, where he says, had material civilization been combined with divine civilization, these fiery weapons would never have been invented. Nay, rather, human energy would have been wholly devoted to useful inventions, would have been concentrated on praiseworthy discoveries. Material civilization is like a lamp glass. Divine civilization is the lamp itself, and the glass without the light is dark. Material civilization is like the body. No matter how infinitely graceful, elegant, and beautiful it may be, it is dead. Divine civilization is like the spirit, and the body gets its life from the spirit. Otherwise, it becomes a corpse. It has thus been made evident that the world of mankind is in need of the breaths of the Holy Spirit. And then in another place, he refers to how East and West should exchange actually in many good things. That, for example, the East must acquire material civilization from the West, and the West must receive spiritual civilization from the East, and that this would establish a mutual bond. And when these two come together, the world of humanity will present a glorious aspect, and extraordinary progress will be achieved, and so on and so forth. So, and then let me conclude with one recorded statement of Abdu'l-Bahá, which actually inspired the title of my talk today. Which is, a ruler must consider himself the real father of all people, just as the father is solicitous about the education of his sons, so a ruler must think about the progress of the inhabitants of the country over which he rules, either by the law of heredity or by the choice of the nation. He must devise new plans of reforms. He must encourage the building of national highways, bridges, schools, railroads, expand the limits of commerce, and ensure the safety and security of the public. If he, on the other hand, devotes his time to luxury, self-gratification, indulgence, and personal likes and dislike, favors favoritism, and laps in the lap of debauchery, he is not a ruler, but a hydra-headed public enemy. A country in this age cannot be ruled by the sword. It needs the magic touch of progress. He says the rulers should expend the income of the state on those sources which would advance the civilization, open the eyes of the people, and let them avail themselves of all technical knowledge and practical accomplishments. Then the people will be happy and contented, and the country shall prosper by leaps and bounds. Thank you very much for being patient. I will be happy to answer questions if there are any. Rob?
Yeah, thanks a lot. That's fascinating. I was wondering where that phrase, the magic touch of progress, came from. And that it really is a lovely comment by Abdu'l-Bahá.
Yeah.
And thank you again. This is fascinating, especially I did not know about Badri Pasha. That was very interesting. That's intriguing that he was in Albania, probably before the Albanians even knew there was a Baha'i there. So it's
I guess so.
You probably have found the first Baha'i in Albania.
Maybe yes, maybe yes.
So let me see. We have some questions and we have some chat here. So I guess I have to go mostly to the question and answer. People should put the questions in the question and answer if they can, I think. Someone did ask, did Bedri Pasha become a Baha'i, or was he just influenced by Baha'i ideals? And I think you've answered that as well as you can.
Yeah. I mean, as I said, identities were fluid. He seems to have been a Baha'i, but in the time of Abdu'l-Bahá, you didn't have, I would say, clear lines, who was a Baha'i. And at some point, Abdu'l-Bahá said, you can be a Jew, you can be a Christian, you can be a Freemason, and then you can be a Baha'i as well. So it probably was a Baha'i, but, maybe not with our standards.
It's interesting that the photograph of him that you had was a photograph of him with his children.
Yes.
Which strikes me as a kind of modern or European kind of thing. How common was it for Ottoman officials to have pictures of themselves with their children?
It's actually common. There are many photographs, yes, with family picture with children, Ottoman officials, normal people. And actually this photo, I discovered that there is a granddaughter of Bedri Pasha in Turkey. And so I contacted her and she sent me this photo.
How nice.
She didn't know he was a Baha'i. So.
That's very interesting.
Yeah.
You had mentioned that Abdu'l-Bahá was writing essays, having them translated into French and having them sent to newspapers and such. Do we have any idea about any of them?
Not that I know, actually. This is one of the things. It's this Ottoman intellectual writing this, but I haven't found anything actually. And he's mentioned in Ottoman newspapers, but I haven't directly seen translations of Abdu'l-Bahá in maybe Amin Echea can answer this at some point.
Well, I don't know if anyone has ever found them. So that, for all we know, 100 years from now, someone might be going to the Le Monde's archives and find an essay by Abdu'l-Bahá or something.
Yeah, that would be great.
Be quite intriguing, actually. You might have some very interesting things to say, actually, that will still be relevant to social change, to the topic today. Adib mentions on the 12th of December 1912, according to Mahmoud Zarqani, Abdu'l-Bahá said the following while in Liverpool, after this journey, the call of the unity of mankind and universal peace must be upraised in the Ottoman territories.
Wow.
Their term shall come, perhaps an effort will be made to unite their various peoples. So I wonder what that refers to. Yeah.
Fascinating. Thanks, Adib.
And he makes a comment also in Paris in March of 1913. I had brought these matters to the attention of the Sultan Abdul Hamid 40 years ago, but alas, for him, he failed to heed my words, occupied himself with his own pursuits, and this has resulted in the state of affairs you see today.
Yeah.
So that's an interesting comment by Abdu'l-Bahá as well. And Adib has been finding all kinds of interesting things.
Yes.
I hope that we do get the second edition of Mahmoud's diary published in English at some point soon. I guess he's working on it, if I remember.
Yes, he does. Hopefully.
Among the things I have done in recent days, in spite of the great severities which confronted me, was to forward 250 letters I have received from the Baha'is of America to Sultan Abdul Hamid, that thereby he might see that the Baha'is make no mention of politics whatsoever. All this correspondence was translated and read for the Sultan by his amanuensis, who added, "This group does not at all interfere in political affairs." The Sultan then thought to himself and stated, "Let us suppose that we were to eradicate all the Baha'is living in Iranian and Ottoman lands. What can we possibly do about the Americans? It would behoove us then to leave them be." The amanuensis then remarked to the Sultan, "Should any harm come to Abdu'l-Bahá, the Americans will grow exceedingly indignant with you." He says, great. Do you know anything about this episode?
I don't know. No, I think this is one of the things Adib is translating.
Yeah, it's an interesting episode. And
I didn't know that.
Didn't you mention, or somebody mentioned, some sort of petition that went to the Sultan from the American Baha'is that I
yes.
I wonder if that's what I wonder if this is a reference to that.
Actually, that was later. That was when Abdu'l-Bahá was in New York. He had just arrived, and then he was invited by the Ottoman ambassador. You know, the Ottomans were observing Abdu'l-Bahá even in the United States. So in Washington, the Ottoman ambassador Yusuf Ziya Pasha was sending letters to Istanbul. And this was the Young Turk government, and Abdullah was deposed already. And so he says that he is inclined to invite Abdu'l-Bahá for a reception. And so he does, actually, and he's very much impressed with Abdu'l-Bahá. And for this and for freeing Abdu'l-Bahá, like the Young Turk Committee, they send a letter of how do you say, thanks to the Ottoman ambassador, who forwarded this to Istanbul with about 800 signatures of American Baha'is in 1912. Yes, this is all in the Ottoman archives in Istanbul.
That's interesting. It seems to me you also mentioned somewhere that the government advised Ziya Pasha not to associate with Abdu'l-Bahá, but he did anyway in Washington with, I think, really quite good results for everybody, fortunately.
Yes, that's right.
That's really intriguing.
Yeah.
Adib is very busy here. At one point, you alluded to the unpublished memoir of Haji Mirza Haidar Ali. Is this different from his Bijatus Sudur?
Yeah.
Something else?
It's different. It's not published. I was lucky enough to get a few pages at the Baha'i World Center when I was serving there. So one Baha'i mentioned that Mithapasha met Abdu'l-Bahá. So I was really, I mean, I knew he met him in Beirut, but I didn't know he met him in Akka. So I asked for the few pages, and luckily the Baha'i World Center shared with me this, and then I incorporated these in my article about Mithapasha and Abdu'l-Bahá in Akka. So this is unpublished. This is still at the Baha'i World Center.
If I ever get to the Garden of Rezvan again outside Akka, I will sit in the benches with a different awareness, thinking that I'm sitting there where the former prime minister of the Ottoman Empire may have sat with Abdu'l-Bahá to discuss all of these weighty matters, not far from Abdu'l-Bahā's new shrine, in fact, for that matter, when that is completed.
It's fascinating.
Carrie says, how should we reflect on the persistent autocratic dominance, which now has a negative connotation in African countries, the Philippines, Brazil, China, Myanmar, Nicaragua, North Korea, Russia, Saudi Arabia, and Turkey, some of which are democratic countries, but not the divine democracy reflected in the teachings?
Difficult to say. I mean, we have to work as Baha'is, I guess. We have to be active.
I think that's a good answer, Fariba says, do we know, she didn't know anything about Badri Pasha. Are the Turkish letters of Abdu'l-Bahá already published?
No, it's also all at the Baha'i World Center. I was lucky enough to use them. Yeah, they're not published yet, but I hope one day.
Yeah, they'll be marvelous.
Yeah.
They should be published in modern Turkish too, so people could read them.
Yeah, exactly. And there are many prayers and like tablets to Baha'is in Iran, in the Caucasus, in Turkish. And it's a nice volume which was printed in Iran twice. And the originals are in Haifa. Well, the originals. And again, I hope that one day I can get the permission to publish these.
Yeah. How far back in his life did Abdu'l-Bahá write in Turkish? Did he learn Turkish while he was in Baghdad, most likely?
Yes, I think so, because in Star of the West, when you read the early issues, there are references to Abdu'l-Bahá, to his Turkish, and I think so, because he was 8 years old, and then, I mean, I know Abdu'l-Bahá is something else, maybe not in need of learning languages, but when I see it from the human side, so a child can really learn a language very quickly, as I did in Germany when I was 8. So I guess Abdu'l-Bahá very quickly learned Turkish, and then he excelled even in Turkish.
Yeah, it's one thing to learn it as a kid around the dinner table and in the bazaar, but it's another thing to be able to write in it well,
Exactly.
as you know. And that's quite an achievement that he could write extremely well in Arabic, Persian, and Turkish. That's really an extraordinary achievement. Shadon Tawfiqi says, in reading your book, Heterodoxy and Orthodoxy, I got the distinctive impression that the Ottoman rulers were, for the most part, not aware of the transition of the faith from the Babi to the Baha'i faith and the distinction from covenant breakers and non-covenant breakers.
Exactly.
Thus, many of the persecutions came from a lack of knowledge. Do you get that impression in your research also?
Yeah, I think so. I think they, especially the episode before the exile to Akka, when a few Baha'is were arrested in Istanbul, like Mishkin Kalam and others, and then the 3 Baha'is selling horses in Istanbul, which were, the saddlebags were full of writings of Baha'u'lláh, actually. And so these were all confiscated. And the report says that, there are about 900 pages of writings of Baha'u'lláh and of Mirza Yahya that were confiscated, that are in the Ottoman archives still. And the report just says that these were read in one day, all of these were read in one day, and then the Ottomans took the decision to exile, to decree further exile. So I think it was very superficial, and I think this is also the reason why Baha'u'lláh really heavily criticizes Abdul Aziz for this injustice, rather than Nasreddin Shah, actually, who killed Babis. I mean, the Ottomans didn't kill any Baha'i, but they were blind, and not. Nasreddin Shah had a reason to kill the Babis, if you will, but the Ottomans didn't have any reason to be, be unjust towards the Baha'is.
Are the materials of Baha'u'lláh that are in the Ottoman archives, are they duplicates of tablets we already knew about, or are they not new, but other tablets that we didn't have much information about?
Yeah, I haven't read really every one of it, but there are tablets that are known, and there are tablets that are not known, which I also learned at the Baha'i World Center. Some tablets are original, not not copies of any other older tablets. And actually, there was also one copy of the Words of Wisdom of Baha'u'lláh, which we knew was from the Akka period, but this makes it earlier, being from Baghdad, Istanbul, or Edirne.
That's true, of course. Yeah, that's. In fact, I'd recently heard that the Words of Wisdom had been redated, so that's why. Oh, that's very interesting.
Yeah.
Bijan says, any unknown nuggets from your research on the interactions between Abdu'l-Bahá and Mithapasha that might have informed either the Ottoman reforms or the content of the Secret of Divine Civilization?
No, unfortunately. There are also memoirs of Mithapasha in 2 volumes in Ottoman Turkish, but he doesn't mention Abbas Effendi or Abdu'l-Bahá, unfortunately. And I guess for a good reason. Because Abdu'l-Bahá himself says, there is a book which was published in 1923 by an Ottoman intellectual called Süleyman Nazif, and who visited Abdu'l-Bahá in Haifa in 1970. And his book about Nasreddin Shah and the Babis, Nazif says that Abdu'l-Bahá told him that Abdu'l-Bahá had contacts with reformers, like he communicated, they exchanged letters, but that Abdu'l-Bahá had burned that letters actually because of Sultan Abdul Hamid's censorship.
Right.
So it may be that there was something about Mithapasha and Abdu'l-Bahá, but it's not existent anymore. I don't know.
And that was, I gather, somewhere I read that there was a similar question about Abdu'l-Bahā's correspondence with, is it Muhammad Abdu or Rashid Ridda, that those men's correspondence in Arabic has been published, but the correspondence with Abdu'l-Bahá wasn't included. Seems to me I heard that because of maybe this was something that Will McCants commented about.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah, that's an interesting problem. Someone asked about how to find out more about the course on the secret of divine civilization. So I'm going to paste a link into the chat so that people can click on that link and find out more about the course, and then they can click through from there to register if someone's curious about that. And let's see, reference to all these, thank you. I'm not sure what that's a question about. Jan Yassian says the Ottoman embassy in London was collecting articles about the master and gave them to him, to Abdu'l-Bahá, I guess. So that's kind of interesting that that embassy was also, I guess, perhaps alerted. Lily was interested in Adib to provide references to the things he referred to. So maybe Adib can reply in the chat to Lily. Reza Garachamani asks about whether there are letters of Abdu'l-Bahá in Turkish or Azeri, and I guess Azeri being in a dialect of Turkish.
It's you can see, like, even if it's in the Arabic script, you can sometimes see it's Azeri dialect. Because of
Azeri language, I suppose it is considered a separate language now.
So many of established Baha'is are in Azeri language, actually, not in Turkish. So because in his time there weren't many Baha'is in Turkey, what we know as Turkey, but in Iran and Azerbaijan and the Caucasus, actually. So many of his letters are to those Baha'is.
Iranian Azerbaijan has a lot of Turkish speakers, as I understand it.
Yes.
Yeah, and they have a distinctive accent. That's quite interesting that they're in Azeri. Has the Secret of Divine Civilization been translated into, he says, Ottoman Turkish? Presumably you'd want to translate it into modern Turkish. At the time, was it translated into Ottoman Turkish and known by Ottoman intellectuals? Or did it influence them?
Not that I know. I haven't found anything yet. Maybe it's somewhere. Maybe there is a copy. That would be great, actually. As you know, I showed the first and the last page of a manuscript of Secret of Divine Civilization in the Majlis Library in Tehran. So we have early versions of that in Iran, but I don't know anything about the Ottomans. But what I can say is that in 1921-22, someone published an Ottoman Turkish translation of Abdu'l-Bahá's tablet to the Hague.
Not long after the tablet was revealed, in fact, then, because it was revealed in 1919.
Exactly.
That's quite interesting. Now, the Secret of Divine Civilization's in Persian, right?
Yeah.
So there was no Arabic translation that we know about?
I think there is. An Arabic translation.
Early translation?
I don't know if it's early. I have to check that.
Because I suppose some of the Ottoman reformers would have known Arabic.
Yeah.
So
I would say most of the higher officials could read at least Arabic and Persian, and sometimes they all even wrote in Persian and Arabic. Also like poetry and literature. So
they would have had access to Secret of Divine Civilization in Persian, even in Istanbul, then a large number of people.
I think so.
That makes sense. So Persian was a pretty widely known language, I guess. That's interesting. And we have, Adib has given people the reference in Badi'u'l-Awtar, Volume 2, which is very good. I don't see any other questions right offhand. Was Abdu'l-Bahá, regarding to the tobacco regime, was Abdu'l-Bahá against the British having their way with growing tobacco and having the tobacco monopoly in Iran?
Sorry.
That's over in the chat. I went over I'm looking in the chat. Someone basically is asking about that British monopoly over the raising and selling of tobacco in Iran.
Was Abdu'l-Bahá against it?
What did he say about the tobacco?
I don't think he refers. I have to check, but I don't think he really talks about that. But he just says that the ulama shouldn't interfere in such things. But I don't know, actually. No,
Yeah, because they were the
yeah,
they were the ones who led the resistance to it.
Yeah,
It seems to me, and
exactly.
managed to get it overturned.
Yeah,
I can remember what I read a long time ago. So Abdul Hamid was still in power when Abdu'l-Bahá was freed in 1908.
Yes. Abdul-Hamid was forced to reinstall the Constitution of 1876, which he had suspended, also the Parliament. And but then a few months later, there was a counter-revolution in 1909, actually, in April, like Gregorian calendar, which was led by religious students, and which was staged by religious students of Istanbul, and supposedly Abdul-Hamid allowed them to do so, to stage the revolution against the Young Turks. But it was not successful, and it was actually, I think it ended somehow bloody, and Abdul-Hamid was just deposed after this in 1909.
And that was the end of the Sultanate.
Yes.
Right.
No, not yet. There were others, but then the end of the Sultanate was in 1922 with Ataturk.
With Ataturk.
Yeah.
I have to get all the way up to Ataturk. Okay.
Yeah. And in 1924, the Caliphate was abolished. Yeah.
Okay. Let me see what else we have here. Various other comments have been coming in. And sometimes questions. I think that looks like everything we've got here right offhand that I can see. I'm trying to think what else I had. The other questions I had. People are saying thank you very much for your presentation. It really was quite fascinating.
My pleasure. Thank you.
When Abdu'l-Bahá went to Beirut, when the tablet, the Lohe Arzebah, was revealed, was that for him to meet Mithapasha, or was that a different? That was.
That was the one. Yes. That was the one. And it's interesting. We know that Abdu'l-Bahá was still a prisoner, but some of the Ottoman officers were very friendly, and the edict, the exile decree, wasn't effective actually anymore. So even though Bahá'u'lláh and Abdu'l-Bahá were officially prisoners, Abdu'l-Bahá just went by the invitation of Mithapasha to Beirut.
Of course. Well, who's gonna overrule the governor in that case?
And in that case, actually, that was one of the things that Abdul-Hamid was suspicious, actually, because he thought that Mithapasha has too much power. He deposed Abdul Aziz, and then Abdul-Hamid thought that Mithapasha would establish a kingdom in Syria, actually, as Abdu'l-Bahá was later also accused.
Right. That's interesting. Interesting. Was the railroad completed between Akka and Beirut at that point, or did you have to take a boat? I wonder.
I'm not sure, actually. I'm not sure.
I wonder when that was finished. It was certainly finished later on.
I think it was later.
Yeah, interesting.
Yeah.
Jan asks this interesting question. Is there anything in the writings of the master about the Armenian massacres later on?
I haven't seen. I think not in the published ones. I seem to remember that. Let me see. There were many Armenian massacres around the first one around 1895-96 in South Turkey, and then 1909, and then of course the 1915, the real one. I think in one of his letters to one governor in those cities, he mentions something, but this is like unpublished. I'm not sure.
Interesting.
But, it's not official, I guess.
Yeah. Ugur Oflaz asks about the relationship between, I guess, Shoghi Effendi and the Turkish government. Of course, at that time, the Turkish government had no control over Syria anymore. So I don't know if there's anything to say about that.
Well, not in his youth, of course, but later on, we know we know, I mean, this is already the Turkish Republic, the early Turkish Republic, 1920s, 1928, when the Baha'is were arrested for the first time in Istanbul and Izmir. Shoghi Effendi mentions these in his letters in Baha'i administration. He refers to these arrests, and then he comments also in Promised Days Come about Ataturk and his reforms. So it's interesting to read over. And then we know that also what Ruhiya Khanum mentions in Priceless Pearl, that Shoghi Effendi, when the Baha'is were arrested again in 1932-33, that Shoghi Effendi cabled the prime minister about the Baha'is. Yeah, so he was cautious. I think he was rather cautious then. Different from Abdu'l-Bahá, I would say.
Yes, that's interesting. Bijan, I guess Masumian asks whether Mirza-i Shirazi is known to have read The Secret of Divine Civilization or not. I wonder. He was a relative of the Bab and the most influential Shia mujtahid at the time of the tobacco regime.
Exactly. He gave the fatwa against the
British.
Against the British. And he was, as we know from Hassan Bedretti, he was a secret Baha'i. And but I guess a man of his standing would have read The Secret of Divine Civilization, but I'm not sure.
That's an interesting question.
Yeah.
And Dr. Sabet on YouTube asks, any modern political scientists, have they noticed the work of Abdu'l-Bahá about Secret of Divine Civilization, or for that matter, maybe even the Siyasiyyih? Do we know of any modern political scientists referring to it?
I don't think any non-Baha'i mentions it. No, I haven't seen anything.
Yeah,
I think for Middle East historians, it's still an unimportant issue.
Yeah, I think that's probably true.
Yeah,
I think that's probably true. Well, that's about everything that I see here. Really very interesting questions that people have asked, and this has been really a delightful chance to hear about the Ottoman reformers and Abdu'l-Bahā's relationship with them, and for that matter, just the whole history of Ottoman reform, which is a useful thing for Baha'is to know about. I suppose there's some people who wanted to tune that out, but it was actually quite valuable to have some sense of sort of how things were moving at this time, and sort of then what Baha'u'lláh and Abdu'l-Bahá could work with, and what changes they could suggest. So that's, I think, very helpful.
Thank you.
So I want to thank you again.
Thank you
for this really marvelous presentation.
Thank you so much.
We're delighted that you've been able to join us today. I should want to remind everyone once again that next Sunday, the 4th of April, 2 p.m. Sunday, again, not Saturday, we will hear Gwen Eder-Lewis talking about African-American stories of teaching and service. And so we're looking forward to that, and we look forward to seeing everybody again next week. So thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you again, and we're really delighted. Looking forward to seeing everybody next week.
Thank you.
Yeah. Bye-bye.
Take good care. Bye.